tonight, hopefully.
I was getting an echo. I was getting an echo because I set up the YouTube feed on my laptop earlier just to see how it looked, and that started off because I hadn't turned it off yet. So I think we are all set to go. All the technical difficulties have been resolved.
God,
let us proceed.
If only we had some obscure 20th century scientists to help us navigate this technical world we live in, Paul. Because that's your deal. You're a biographer, correct?
I have written 2 biographies of obscure 20th century scientists. Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah. Well, I'm particularly interested in the second book, the follow-up book, about because you've done one on, is it Philo T.
Yeah,
Farnsworth.
Yeah, well, just briefly, the first book that I wrote, which was a story that I discovered in the 1970s, is a biography of a man named Philo T. Farnsworth. And all I will tell you for now about Farnsworth is that he drew a sketch for his high school science teacher when he was 14 years old in 1922. And every video screen on the planet, including the ones we are looking at now, traces its origins to that sketch.
Wow.
So the fact that our screens, our lives are dominated by these screens, but we have no knowledge of the man who made all of this technology possible is just one of the wonders of the 20th and 21st centuries.
So is he a transistor guy or an LCD guy?
I'm sorry?
This Philo guy.
Yeah.
Is he something to do with the invention of transistors?
Not directly, no. He developed the camera tube.
Okay.
Using cathode ray tubes.
Cathode ray, yeah.
That you know, his primary invention was the camera tube that made high resolution possible. Prior to that, television was being attempted with mechanical devices that used spinning discs with a perforation of spiral perforation of holes to try and scan an image.
It's funny you
but
say
that was never going to go fast enough to produce the resolutions that we're looking at now.
That's exactly
so
what's going on
his
under
invention
this
was to
desk.
take all the moving parts out of it and put a pure expression of Einstein's photoelectric effect in a vacuum tube. So it was a very relativistic invention that he dreamed up when he was 14 years old in 1922.
14, jeez.
Is that like rotoscope? There was something called rotoscope that they used to use back in the day. Is that similar tech?
Rotoscope, I think that was one of the early motion picture technologies. I know I've heard that name, but I can't pin down exactly what the origins of it is. There were a lot of names going around at the time. Yeah. Television was referred to as radioscope or a teleramophone. There were a lot of names for it before television was finally settled in. And of course, what we're talking about really is video, and all the many ways that video is the most ubiquitous thing that's ever been invented.
Yeah. One of the things I was listening to you with Greg Carlwood earlier today, and something that really I found particularly interesting, made me think was, you know, since the end of the Second World War, we've had like a huge boom in sort of material sciences and physical technology in that way. You know, we've gone from vinyl records or ceramics to mini discs, lasers, microchips and all this. But as far as like theoretical physics, since that point, we've kind of hit a bit of a brick wall, and it's just sort of drifted into obscure nonsense that's not useful.
Well, it's very interesting that you hit on that theme, because it's one that has been recurring in my own loops here in the past few weeks. And the video that I did with Jesse Michaels, he talks to people like Eric Weinstein and Hal Puthoff, and they make the assertion that there have been no big breakthroughs in theoretical physics in the last 60 years or so. Eric Weinstein says that string theory, which was a big popular theory for a long time, was a dead end. There was a theory of gravitation called quantum theory. That's turned into a dead end. So we have this recurring kind of realization that we haven't had in the last half of the 20th and early parts of the 21st centuries, the kind of breakthroughs that we had at the beginning of the 20th century, when our whole concept of the universe was altered in 1 year by the 4 papers that Albert Einstein released. And that started with the photoelectric effect, for which he received his Nobel Prize in 1921. And then the last paper was, or the third paper, I think, was general relativity, which also introduces E equals mc squared. There have not been those kinds of big shifts in our cosmological understanding of the universe as there was 100 years ago in the last 60 years. And to almost validate that perception, I have in my files here a story that appeared in the New York Times about 2 years ago, which starts with the headline that all scientific breakthroughs stopped, and they actually used the date 1945. And so I then ask the rhetorical question, can we think of anything that happened in 1945 which might have caused the sources of our scientific breakthroughs to have pause in sharing any more such breakthroughs with us? Now, can you think of anything that happened in 1945?
Oppenheimer.
Yeah, nuclear bomb, I mean.
There you go. That's it. Yeah.
But they have developed like more massive and more destructive bombs since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, haven't they?
Well, yippee!
I'm not saying it's a good thing, but
yeah. And it's only by a wonderment of the theory of mutually assured destruction that we haven't.
Right. So they're hiding something from us, are they, then?
Yeah. I'm going to share with you. So since we're already off on this wonderful tangent, I will introduce to the conversation a quotation that I have been citing a bit recently, which will get us perhaps toward the metaphysical theme in all this. So this is something that we talked about Philo Farnsworth. We haven't gotten to Townsend Brown yet, but I'm sure we will. But since we're talking about Farnsworth, at the end of his life, when he was being lauded for having made all this screen technology possible with his inventions in the 1920s and 30s, Philo T. Farnsworth said, "I know that God exists. I know that I have never invented anything. I have been a medium by which these things were given to the culture as fast as the culture could earn them. I give all the credit to God." And so I will extrapolate from that the theory that I have been expressing, having the nerve to express lately, that all the information that humans have received over the span of millennia has been metered out to us by a higher power, a higher source, a supreme intelligence that Farnsworth refers to as God. And in my program of the 12 Steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, which I've been in for 36 years, by the way, we just refer to a higher power. So I am offering right at the start here the postulate that the higher power shared with us some of the greatest secrets of the universe at the turn of the 20th century, and then sat back to see what we would do with that information. And then they saw what we did with it starting in 1945 and said, okay, that's enough.
Yeah.
And there have been no great scientific breakthroughs ever since. So it's time for our humanity to catch up with our technology.
That's always been a big fear, isn't it? That as a species, there's been a danger that our technological advancement would outpace our common sense or sense of humanity, and that we sort of.
I think we can readily agree that that's the case. I also ran into a biologist recently. His name is Edward O. Wilson, and he made the observation that the problem with mankind is that we are governed by Paleolithic emotions. We are constrained by medieval institutions, and we are overwhelmed with godlike technologies. And isn't that it in a nutshell? That's our dilemma.
Yep, it's a great point.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. So I'll just, take the initiative here, and I say that what I've been privileged to see in the work that I've done over the course of my lifetime, I think are indications of advanced technologies that have been revealed to mankind, but that remain out of our grasp. They are within our reach, but they're outside of our grasp. And that's the central theme that I draw with the biography of Philo T. Farnsworth, who went on in the later years of his life to develop a nuclear fusion process. And then with Thomas Townsend Brown, whose story revolves around the mystery of whether he found a way to synthesize gravity.
Right. So you don't like the term anti-gravity, do you, Paul? You have a problem with it?
Yeah, I've said that, many times. It's because it kind of reverses what's actually going on. I mean, I can understand how you arrive at that terminology as a conclusion, but we are not simply negating gravity as we are. If what we're talking about is true, we are synthesizing gravity. We are creating an alternate gravitational field, which has the effect of, like, if you have two magnets. So if you have a magnet with the North Pole facing up, and then you have an electromagnet, and then you begin to add the current of that electromagnet, and that has the North Pole facing down, they will repel each other. And that's what I believe Townsend Brown was doing with what I would describe as a synthetic or artificial gravitational effect. But anti-gravity is kind of the common cultural term, but I think there's just a misconception embodied in that I think is better expressed by saying synthetic gravity or gravity control.
Cool. Okay. Well, let's go in.
And then that obviously, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, go on, carry on.
Well, no, I was going to say, what's interesting and intriguing about the story is that when you begin to talk about being able to produce artificial gravity, then you go back to Einstein's 1915 theory of general relativity, where he redefines gravity as the curvature in the space-time continuum, where space and time are the fabric of the same continuum. And then the theory becomes that the enticing theory is that if you have now the electrical means by which you can bend space in order to induce artificial gravity, you're also bending time.
Yikes. We'll save that till later.
And I can sure see where if there's a higher intelligence in the universe that is metering this information out to us, that they may have revealed it to certain individuals in the course of their lifetime in the first half of the 20th century. But once they saw what we've been doing with this information in the second half of the 20th century, they figured, well, okay, these kids need to grow up before they can get the keys to the cosmic Ferrari.
Let's go back. Tell us a bit about the story of Townsend Brown, Thomas Townsend Brown. Like, when was he born? Where did he grow up? What's his sort of background?
All right, so I'll start by making the observation that both Townsend Brown and Philo T. Farnsworth, the two people that I've written about, were born within a year of Einstein's Annus Mirabilis, 1905. So Brown was born in 1905, Farnsworth in 1906. So they grew up in a world in which the paradigm had already shifted.
Right.
And Townsend Brown was the scion, the heir to a construction and granite quarry fortune in Ohio, here in the United States, and was raised in a very affluent environment. His parents had the means to indulge his very youthful interest in all things electrical and electronic. There's a story in the book where a visitor to the house sees this kid out in the yard, and he's just scooping earthworms off the ground because he says he has electrified the fence, and that is causing the earthworms to scurry to the surface. So already at the age of 10, he is showing an advanced knowledge with things electrical. He's building radio sets as a teenager, comes to the attention of the national security establishment, such as it was during World War I, because they were afraid that with his radio system, he might be able to transmit or receive signals from the Germans.
When he was a teenager.
So that was his first. When he was a teenager, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And then he had a kind of a spotty education. And the story is that when he did get to MIT for a while, and he studied with a Nobel laureate by the name of Robert Millikan, who received his Nobel Prize for determining the electrical charge of an electron. But he was not enamored of the regimentation of the routines that freshmen had to deal with in the environment of MIT, but he nevertheless, during a demonstration at MIT of something called a Coolidge tube, which is an X-ray tube, he observed that when the X-ray tube was hung in a harness so that it could swing, that when the voltage was applied to it, that it had a tendency to surge or thrust in one direction. And that was the genesis of all the discoveries and all the work that he did, starting again as he was a teenager. He left MIT and went back to Ohio and studied at Denison University with a professor there, the astronomer who ran the Swayze Observatory at Denison, and got into talking with him about what he had discovered, and was talking about what Einstein was working on at the time, which was the unified field. Einstein was basically looking for the connection between electromagnetism and gravity. And when Townsend Brown, who had observed this phenomenon, was discussing it with his professor Biefeld, he asked Biefeld, how might a device that could couple electricity with gravity, how would it manifest? Biefeld said it would probably be in something like a capacitor. And so there, in a very quick thumbnail sketch, is the essential arc of the early story, the genesis of Townsend Brown, and how he comes to be building asymmetric capacitors, which may or may not have actually demonstrated an anti-gravity effect.
So he was kind of a man of leisure in some ways.
You caught me. I went and I used the term anti-gravity there, so I'm busted.
So he was obviously a man of means, which allowed him to pursue his passion without having to, get a
his family was quite wealthy. Yeah, they had an enormous estate and properties in Ohio, a big ranch in Kansas with, I think, there's something in the book about how the ranch had 300 miles of barbed wire, and they also had an estate in Pasadena, and he built his own laboratory there in the mansion in Pasadena as well. Yeah.
Did he have any dealings with JPL? Who's the guy who set up JPL?
The rocket lab.
So that's the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena?
The guy...
not directly. Yeah.
Because there was L. Ron Hubbard.
Grumman.
L. Ron Hubbard was knocking around with him, and they were into Aleister Crowley and also... Bob
Something Grumman, isn't it?
Well, when you mention L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, the name that comes to mind is Alva Kitzelman, who was a friend, I believe, of Hubbard's. And I haven't got a great mastery of the details here, but Kitzelman said at one point that he had a conversation with Hubbard that planted the seed in Hubbard's mind that eventually became Dianetics and Scientology. So all this stuff is strangely interconnected.
Man, it's there is a lot of strange connections back then, isn't there? Amongst all this stuff.
Jack Parsons, that's who I'm thinking of.
Jack Parsons.
Jack Parsons. We did a show on a while back.
Now that's not a name that I readily recall.
No, fair enough. He's probably another obscure 20th century scientist who you could delve into for your next book, Paul.
Well,
so
it took me 25 years to write the first one. It took me 25 years to write the second one. And I'm 73 now. Do the math.
Yeah, you got another couple of books in you. I'll be a pessimist. So we left Townsend Brown, who is a sort of a young man. Tell us about it, because he goes into doesn't he go into the military?
Yeah, he entered the Navy in 1930. Now, the family did suffer some financial setbacks along with the rest of the world in after the crash in 1929. And he said at the time that he had always loved the Navy and boats, and there's at least one good story about a time when he went sailing with his fiance in 1926 or thereabouts. But yeah, he joined the Navy thinking that he might be able to get some help there with the things that he was working on, and he wound up at an institution here in the United States called the Naval Research Laboratory. And he actually did some interesting work with them in the fluid dielectric version of what we're talking about. There's two ways that what we're calling the biefeld-brown effect, which is his primary discovery, the two ways that it manifests are with fluid dielectrics, which can be air or liquids, or solid dielectrics. And it's the solid dielectrics where we believe we find the artificial gravity effect or the synthetic gravity effect. But he did some work with the NRL with the fluid dielectrics and came up with a whole system where if you ran the fluid through the device, it would generate electricity. If you ran the device through the fluid, let me think. There were three manifestations of it, and I haven't talked about that lately, so I don't know if I can rattle them all off. But it was a complete system based on the fluid dielectric effect.
Right. You'll have to explain the term.
And there's been some speculation also that was what may have gone into what the movie Hunt for Red October called the magnetodynamic drive. That's the silent drive that ran the submarine, the silent submarine.
So is dialect?
That's the kind of work he was doing at the.
Yeah. When you mention when you say dielectrics, is this what he found with the cathodes when you had a cathode where one ray was longer than the other or something, that you had this effect?
Yeah. So when we're talking about a capacitor, there's basically three components to a capacitor. You have a negatively charged electrode, you have a positively charged electrode, and then you have the substance between them, which is called the dielectric. And it's the dielectric that causes the storage of the charge, which makes it a capacitor. And then that charge is released into whatever circuit you're building. So the capacitor, the dielectric can be either a fluid. Now, have you availed yourself to any of the videos on the internet of the lifters, the triangular kite-looking things with the aluminum foil at one end and the wire at the other?
I'm sure
those are all attributed to Townsend Brown, and that's using a fluid dielectric. There's air between the two components of those devices. So that's a fluid dielectric, and it's actually ionic wind that causes them to levitate. But the solid dielectric, I've got a sample of it here. This is a material called barium titanate, and it has a very high, what's called the K level, which is the ability to store the electric charge. And this barium titanate has a very high K level and has been used in demonstrations of the Townsend Brown gravitator.
Would I be right in
solid
thinking
dielectric.
Are most capacitors, do they have a ceramic dielectric? Is that right?
I think it's a variety of materials. Right. Some of them are ceramic. Others are more like silicon.
Right. I mean, the idea is if you've ever worked on a computer, once you take the lid off a computer, you've got to earth or ground the insides, because these capacitors, same with guitar amps, they can store a big whacking voltage and give you a shock if you touch the wrong part. So this is the nature of a capacitor. And so I guess what's interesting about these lifters you just mentioned. So these are things that can levitate, they can produce lift, but there's no moving parts.
There's no moving parts.
Yeah, so we're not like a drone would have a rotating blade, like a helicopter. You have like jump jets, which use thrust from combustion engines, essentially. But this is what's so special about the lifters. This thing is lifted off the ground without having any moving parts.
Without having any moving parts. But there's a couple of things to say about the lifters. The first is that because, so I'll describe it for you. Imagine a triangle at the base, which is about 2 inches of aluminum foil. So you've got, 3 sides of aluminum foil about 2 inches high. At each corner of the 3 points of the triangle, there's like a balsa wood post, and then a wire connecting the tops of the balsa wood post in that triangle. So now you have this triangular aluminum foil base and the posts to separate the base from the wire above. And when it is charged, when you apply a voltage to it, the wire becomes charged and it's positively charged and generates an ion flow, and it's that ion flow that causes the lifter to jump off the table. So I mean, it just literally goes zoop like that, and it has to be tethered down or it'll fly away. But the pertinent point is it has to be connected to an electrical source.
Right.
So you have a power supply over here that generates the voltage, hundreds of kilowatts, that are then applied to, but it has to be connected to that at all times, and you can't bring that with you.
Got you.
So it's an interesting demonstration of a principle, but absent the ability to put a power supply on it, it's not going very far.
What about photovoltaic power supply? Would that be feasible?
Not very efficient.
That's a possibility, except that photovoltaic, when we're talking about photovoltaics and solar power, we're doing really well if we can get a centiwatt out of it, if we can get 100 watts. And we're talking about kilowatts. And the understanding around the Biefeld-Brown effect is you don't really start to get the connection between electricity and gravity until you're talking megawatts.
What about travel in a vacuum, Paul?
Okay, so that's one of the things that people often ask about the Townsend Brown effect or the Biefeld-Brown effect. Does it work in a vacuum? And there's actually, in 2006, we have a show here, and I love it, by the way. I haven't even talked at all about, I get to be in the UK with you guys because I'm an Anglophile. But so I don't know if we have a show here in the States called Mythbusters. I don't think it's on anymore. I don't know if yeah. And they actually did a demonstration where they put a lifter in a vacuum chamber, and when it didn't work, when it didn't lift in the vacuum chamber, they said, okay, so that proves that there's no antigravitic effect, no electrogravitic effect. But there never would have been, because you've removed the air, so you're not going to get the ionized air. It's not going to lift. But if you use the solid dielectrics, it's an entirely different proposition. And there are records of tests that have been done in vacuum chambers with solid dielectrics where we do see the evidence of this electrogravitic effect.
Do the solid things, do they degrade over time, over use?
I don't have good data on that because I'm not aware of tests that have been done where the effect has been tested for any long period of time. So that's a good question. We'll have to build one and test it.
I don't know if anyone knows where I'm going here, but I am going into space as a potential sort of ion drive engine, because you don't have to have a lot of motion in space. A little bit of acceleration will get you a long way over a period of time because there's no particle resistance, because you're in a vacuum. If that solid dielectric stuff doesn't degrade, then would that not be an interesting source for probes? Obviously not people. I wouldn't want to be.
Don't want to be probed.
Don't want to be probed.
Well,
but,
I believe your hypothesis is worthy.
Yes, finally.
And I say, it's a hypothesis. It's a worthy one, meaning it's worthy of further investigation using the scientific method to determine if it's valid or not. I would also encourage us to think in an entirely different dimension, that if in fact, again, what we're talking about is producing artificial gravitational fields, then what impact does that have on the space around us? And do we even need an ion drive, or can we produce enough of effect to bend the space so that our destination becomes that much closer?
A warp drive.
It's called a warp drive.
Yeah.
Wormhole drive.
Yes.
Excellent.
Let me drop another little thought bomb into this conversation, because I love where this is
Keep
going.
lobbing
And again,
them,
this
yeah.
is another quotation. This is another quotation from Philo Farnsworth, who had his own dreams about space travel, and they do dovetail nicely with some of Townsend Brown's work. But he asked the rhetorical question once: why do we think we need to spend so much energy to travel through something which is basically nothing?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, the trick is getting
about
into the
that one.
nothing, isn't it?
Yeah.
The trick is getting out of the atmosphere.
I'm just wondering, you
Right.
know,
And so far, the only way we have found to get out of the atmosphere is what I like to describe.
Massive fucking explosions.
It is this. I'm sorry that I interrupted us.
No,
Stream
sorry.
there.
No, it's fine. Go
Yeah.
on.
The only way we've figured to get out of the atmosphere so far is by using what is essentially the same force that cavemen used to barbecue their wildebeests.
Yeah.
very old.
It's fire. It's just fire. It's very concentrated fire, but it is a chemical reaction, as is fire. And when you look at modern rocketry, you're looking at an equation where most of the fuel is burned up, getting the rest of the fuel off the launch pad.
Yeah.
So inefficient.
Big rail
Yeah,
gun
it's a
or
tad
something.
inefficient. Or is what so let me tell you this story, because this speaks to how Townsend Brown himself described rocketry. He described it as brute and awkward force. And I think that's an apt description, particularly when you view it against what he described to his girlfriend, his fiancée, Josephine, when they were courting in the 1920s. Now, he had already had whatever vision he had of how the universe works and how technology might be evolved to take advantage of other unseen forces in the universe. So on their second date, Townsend Brown takes Josephine Beale, who would later become his wife, takes her sailing on Buckeye Lake in central Ohio. And Josephine was already aware that she was being courted by somebody who had some pretty special ideas. And Townsend was comfortable with her as somebody that he could open up to and share these ideas with. So as they're sailing along Buckeye Lake, she kind of turns to him and in a teasing way says, "So, Mr. Smarty, what's going to happen in the future? What will become of mankind?" And Townsend takes a beat and he says, "We will push away from the earth as easily as this boat pushed away from the dock. And we will sail through the heavens as easily as this boat is crossing this lake."
Nice.
So that was his vision of, let's call it interstellar travel, as opposed to the brute and awkward force of burning up a ton of chemical propellant in order to get the rest of the propellant out of the atmosphere.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's go back to his personal stories. So I think we left it off where he was in the military, and what was the Naval Research Lab? Was it? He was
The Naval Research Lab, or the NRL, which was probably the United States' paramount military research facility in the 1920s and 30s. So he went to work there starting in about 1930, was in and out of the Navy throughout the 1930s, and then actually left the Navy officially once and for all in 1942. So shortly after America's involvement in World War II, he leaves the Navy. And then he went to work in Los Angeles at a place called Vega Aircraft. And that is when the work that he was doing begins to disappear behind the curtain.
So he went into the private sector just as America's getting into the Second World War. This guy who's obviously brilliant and interested, he'd be a useful asset to the US military establishment, and they just let him wander into the private sector and leave him to it?
Well, I think that the skepticism you're expressing there is all well placed. That is probably they put him where he could do the most good for the long-term war effort without being subject to whatever the constraints of military research were. By being in the private sector, he's got more latitude. Right. And in the same way that even though the Los Alamos project was done under the aegis of the military, it was essentially a private enterprise being developed on its own outside of the military establishment. So what he was working on, we really don't have a clear sense of, because there really are no records of it, other than the paper that he wrote, which is simply described, it's the Vega Aircraft Notes, in which he has the document that we call Structure of Space. It says it is called Structure of Space, where he is speculating about how, in fact, time and space can be manipulated.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing was he involved in, what's the name of the 1945?
Los Alamos in the...
No, Manhattan Project.
Not to our knowledge. So no, not directly. In later years, he did work with some people who had been at Los Alamos. What was his name? Bradford Shank was somebody who had been at Los Alamos, and he worked with Brown in Los Angeles in the 1950s. So some of that work spilled over, but Brown himself was not directly involved in the Manhattan Project. And can I go on a tangent here for a moment while we're talking about the Manhattan Project?
Yeah.
Okay. So you're probably not of this country. You're probably not aware of well, maybe you are, because it's world history at this point, but every great physicist in the world had something to do with Los Alamos, including Niels Bohr showing up there, and Anthony Szilard, and just the greatest physicists and scientists of the time were involved somehow in the Manhattan Project. So I like to tout the name of the most prominent scientist of the middle 20th century who was not involved in the Manhattan Project. You want to guess?
Ben?
Feynman?
No, he was there. He was the guy, if you saw Oppenheimer, Feynman was the guy with the bongo drums.
Oh, yes. Yes, he was. Yeah, I remember now.
It was up. Yeah, that was Feynman, yeah. No, that's one guess. You get two more.
Oh.
If you want to.
No.
No, I have no idea. No idea.
Okay. Pass. Okay.
Pass.
It was Philo T. Farnsworth.
Oh.
We should have said.
We should have known that.
And there is a story in my book, The Boy Who Invented Television, where he was actually approached in the 1940s by somebody who flew a private plane from Chicago in hop, skips, and jumps to where Farnsworth was encamped in Maine during World War II, to invite him to work on a top secret project in Chicago, which would have been the Fermi pile, where they first demonstrated controlled fission as a precursor to developing the bombs. And Farnsworth was approached and asked if he would be part of that project, and he declined the invitation. And he turned to his wife after this guest left and went back to Chicago, and he said, "I think they're building an atomic bomb, and I want no part of it."
Wow.
Fair play. Every credit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Was this to do with how does Operation Paperclip work into this? Was that after the war, when all the German scientists started getting shipped on?
It's funny you should ask, because I'm reading a book right now by a woman named Annie Jacobson, and it's called Operation Paperclip.
Right.
And she has done a marvelous world of research into everything that went into bringing a whole boatload of German/Nazi scientists to the United States in the 5 or 10 years after World War II. The most prominent of which, speaking of rocketry and burning great quantities of fuel to get the rest of the fuel out of the atmosphere, you know who the most prominent scientist to come over in Operation Paperclip was?
I don't know.
Werner
von Braun, was it?
There you go. Somebody right, ding, 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 ring a bell. Somebody
ding,
named
ding,
it. Yeah.
ding, ding, ding. Yeah. Werner von Braun.
Yep. Yeah. Werner von Braun, who was the rocket mastermind of the entire Apollo project, who basically designed the Saturn V rocket that got man to the moon, was
definitely not a Nazi.
German scientist during World War II.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we know it very well in Britain because, you know, when we're kids, we learn about the V1 and the V2 rocket, which was the doodle bug, they used to call it. And
Doodle bug, right.
They were
right.
they were essentially weapons
So-
of terror. You know, they terrified the British people.
Yeah. And I've been and I have just read the passage in Annie Jacobson's book where she talks about just that. Wow. And the terror, those devices were built for one purpose and one purpose only, and that was to terrorize the British populace. And I think they succeeded in that. Sidebar. About 3 months ago, I went to Huntsville, Alabama, which is about an hour and a half south of where I live here in Nashville. And there is a rocket center there. There's a museum to America's mid-20th century rocket program, because Huntsville is where the rockets were developed and then taken to Florida for the launch. And there is one display of a Saturn V rocket stretched out, and it's just this gigantic fuel tank. But the reason I bring it up is because you mentioned the V2s, and there is one display, and it's actually it's a recreation of Werner von Braun's office there in Huntsville. And kind of behind his desk are little models of all the rockets that he built. And at the end of the display is the Saturn I, which was the first Saturn that they used to get like Apollo 8 just into Earth orbit before they took Apollo 11 all the way to the moon, to the Saturn V.
Allegedly.
And the Apollo 1 goes all the way to the ceiling. And the Saturn V is so much bigger that it has to go through a hole in the ceiling. That's how much more fuel they needed. But the reason I bring it up is because at the very beginning of this display, on the far end, it shows the V1 and the V2 rockets. And it attributes those rockets to Werner von Braun, but it doesn't make any reference to what they were used for.
Wow. Yeah, keep quiet about that.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. We don't want to make too big a deal. Where Dr. von Braun got his start.
Well, it's a direct lineage, isn't there, all the way back to obviously his work in Nazi Germany, and there's no getting away from it, is there? Yeah, basically.
There isn't. No, there isn't. Yeah,
You
if
just
you
don't
want
talk
to,
about
once
it.
you peel the Band-Aid off, it's all right there to see.
Yeah.
So what
And
happened?
in the scope of human history, it's sad to say that was not so long ago.
No.
No, I've just started watching The World at War recently on your recommendation, Matt. I don't know. You probably didn't get it over there, Paul, but it was a BBC documentary series from the 1970s. Narrated by Laurence Olivier.
It is a Laurence Olivier.
Oh,
Yeah.
cool.
And it's like
I don't know if I've seen that one. We recently had a series here on Apple TV Plus called Masters of War, which was about the Allied bombing efforts starting in 1943. Yeah.
Wow.
And it was a pretty well done series. It really goes into some depth about the stakes that the B-17s had to face when they started flying over the channel and into Germany to begin trying to eliminate the German war effort to soften up the landscape so that they could invade in 1944.
Right. Well, the US Air Force were confident that they could fly in during the day. And so they had these tightly packed squadrons with some escorts, I think, as well. But they soon found out that the Luftwaffe were pretty good at shooting them down. But yeah, for a long time, it was the US flying in the day, and the the Brits flying at night.
Yes.
And
that's right.
the bombing accuracy of the British planes was like
Horrendous.
horrific. If you got a bomb within 5, we're laughing about it like it's funny, but if you got a bomb within 5 miles of a target, that was about average, and you might hit the odd orphanage here and there. You know, it was just completely indiscriminate.
The Allies, they had this a very advanced bomb site, the Norden bomb site, that gave them a very high degree of accuracy. The bomb site had the ability to take into account the speed of the airplane, the altitude, and the distance to the target, and release the bombs so that they would land on the target.
Yeah,
they were very effective. They basically were able to wipe out the Luftwaffe before D-Day, because Eisenhower had said, "I can't do this if we're going to be subject to aerial bombardment." And so the Allies pretty much wiped out the Luftwaffe before D-Day in June 6, 1944.
One of my favorite things I've seen on the documentary so far is that early in the war, the Luftwaffe flew over to the UK and they destroyed most of the British Air Force on the ground when they were in hangars and on runways. And so the British government started this campaign. We need your scrap metal. Bring us your pots, your pans. We need all this metal that we can get to rebuild our Air Force. And it was complete nonsense. It was complete propaganda. And you've got movies of these guys saying, we've no idea what to do with this stuff. They've got mountains of pots and pans and jugs and jars.
It's just useless.
It was useless. It was just messaging.
Yeah. Now, was that before or after Churchill took over? Because Chamberlain, there was the whole Chamberlain thing where he just could not recognize well enough in advance what was going on in Germany and the impact that it was going to have. And then eventually Churchill took over and masterminded the effort that eventually disposed of the Germans. But it was a challenging time, to say the least.
Well, I think it was after. Sorry, when he was in charge. That was the Battle of Britain, basically. When it was it Operation Sea Lion? Was that what it was called? The invasion of Britain.
Yeah.
So, which was apparently that's what it says in the documentary. I don't know if you're up to there. It was a ruse for Operation Barbarossa,
which was the attack on the Eastern Front to Russia, pushing to Stalingrad and whatnot.
Basically, So it was 1941, I would say. I think for the Battle of Britain. I think.
Yeah. It's kind of wild. It's
I've been kind of revisiting a lot of this stuff because I don't know if you've heard, but we're having our own interesting political challenges here in the United States.
Yeah, a little.
Yeah, I love it. It's great. It's really entertaining from this side of the pond.
Well, yeah, we've settled down recently, haven't we? Actually?
I'm glad you're enjoying it. But, there's that old saying that history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And I'm not sure who said that. Maybe it was Mark Twain, but the echoes that we're getting of history in what's going on in American politics right now are, how shall we say, to an open mind, a little disturbing. So I've been kind of revisiting a lot of that old history to see how things were dealt with during that period in the 1930s and 40s in Europe. It was not one of the great periods of human history.
Are you alluding to like a rise in populism or an increased polarization? Is that the sort of vibe you have over there now?
Oh, I don't know that populism is the right word. I think fascism is probably closer to it.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure where you draw the line between populism and fascism, but we'll just use the phrase autocracy. That we're seeing a disturbing drift in a large part of the American populace toward having somebody at the top of the chain of command who has expressed a desire to use his power, autocratic autocratically. There you go. Thank you. My mouth broke. Yeah, autocratically. Yeah.
There's an interesting statistic. Is it 40% of the world's countries or the world's population are going to the polls this year? Not Poland, the polling station. There's elections happening all the time. You know, I don't sort of put much weight into politics. I don't pay much attention. I just find it entertaining more than anything else. I'm more of a whoever you vote for, the government always gets in kind of. That's my philosophy, really. But to be fair, we haven't had a Trump.
No.
Whoa, we had a Bojo, didn't we?
Oh yeah, we did have Bojo the clown though, and he was a complete waste of space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, you know.
Well, you know, we had our traumatic event in 2016 with the election of Trump, and you had your traumatic event with Brexit. And I don't want to go down that avenue because I don't know how you feel about that one. But I had a friend who was in Britain at the time that vote came through, and the way she describes the circle of people that she was in, the reaction was much the same as the circle of friends that I was in here in the States when the 2016 election was declared. So,
yeah, the thing is, people watch too much news.
We've all experienced some trauma here.
People watch too much news and too much TV, and they were saying the economy is going to collapse. We'll have no human rights. This, that, and the other. The biggest disaster in our nation's history. People just get on with their lives, and you know they just don't want to be interfered with by. You know, if the governments leave people alone, they'll just get on with their lives and make the best of it. But you know, we get fed a diet of headlines and news, and if it bleeds, it leads, and all the rest of it. And you got to disconnect from that shit. It's not good for you. It's not good for your brain.
Right. If I never see a headline again that says "breaking news," it'll be too soon. You know, it's like. Yeah, what do you mean breaking news? It's been happening all day.
Do you think it's kind of cathartic spending your time looking back? You know, looking back into history, events that have already happened. It's a way to sort of get away from what's happening in the current milieu and, you know, sort of lose yourself in history.
You know, it's an interesting question because it is cathartic in the sense that it has a kind of a romantic quality to it, to look back on the past and see things that we've missed. And when I'm talking about the Farnsworth story, one of the things that appealed to me about it was when I began to look at the prehistory of television. Now here, I guess there's some British connections between the Farnsworth story and the history in Britain as well. But when I began to look at some of the illustrations from that period, I realized there was a whole prehistory that we had no knowledge of. You know, we see pictures of biplanes, for example, after the Wright brothers, but we don't see any pictures of the earliest forms of television from the 20s and 30s. So there's a romantic quality, and it is cathartic in the sense that you see the potential of great minds to see possibilities where others have not seen them. And that's the story of how television was introduced. It's exciting in some senses because we also get some sense, particularly with the Farnsworth and Brown stories, of what else might be possible. But then it becomes frustrating because you wind up asking the question, well, why can't we have these things? And what is holding them back? Now, we've talked with the Brown story about the apparent likelihood that he was on the threshold, at least, of finding a connection between electromagnetism and gravity that would give us the ability to produce synthetic artificial gravitational fields, and as he said to his wife, push away from the Earth as easily as their sailboat pushed away from the dock. That's the appeal, the exciting appeal of the Brown story. In the Farnsworth story, what always hooked me on that story from the very beginning was he spent the latter half of his life developing a nuclear fusion process. And I will describe that to you only by oversimplifying it, but he was developing what amounted to a device roughly the size of what you guys call a football, and we call a soccer ball. So it's about this big, capable of generating megawatts of pure electricity.
Nice.
That's what Philo Farnsworth developed. He talked with Albert Einstein about it in 1948. He had a phone call with Einstein. And when Einstein heard what Farnsworth was developing, and at this point it was still in a very formative stage, he hadn't actually had the conception for the device that he went on and built in the 1950s and 60s. But he was formulating some math and some theory, and he got to talk with Albert Einstein for about an hour on the phone. And Einstein very much encouraged him to continue that work. Remember that now, as we get into the late 40s, Einstein had been, I don't know if discouraged is the right word, but he was disturbed at the role that he had played in the development of atomic weaponry and Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he had withdrawn some from public circles and scientific research. But when he heard what Farnsworth had developed in the way of a nuclear fusion process, he was excited by it. He said, this is the good part of my work. This is the good part of my theories, and you must continue this work. And he did, and he went on and he developed a nuclear fusion process. And it's still very exciting to me, but it's a sign of we only got so far in the decades after World War II, and we've been in a kind of a scientific vacuum ever since.
It makes you wonder, just to get slightly conspiratorial for a minute, whether, you know, I don't think there's much down for you if you start messing around with free energy devices. I think you're probably going to end up...
You'll ride off a cliff on a Segway.
On a Segway, you'll have a light aviation accident, or you'll be, you know, die a heart attack in a hot tub somewhere.
Yeah, the heart attack.
Yeah.
But, you know, we're talking about the energy sector is one of the biggest industries in the world. And anything that threatens that revenue, I mean, people won't think twice of knocking someone out the game. What's it cost to have someone whacked? 20 grand?
Ooh, I don't
you
know.
It's small beans when you're talking about a multi...
Would you not encourage people?
I'll do it for fun.
Do you not think like that, Paul?
I'm sorry, this conversation has to end here. You didn't use my name, did you?
You know, you wonder what...
Yeah, sorry, Andrew.
Stay away from light aviation, Andrew. Paul, Andrew.
I'm calling in from an undisclosed location. Please don't tell anybody.
But do you not think, you know, we're talking about this dearth in breakthroughs for the last 60 years. Do you not think there's a risk of that people can be silenced, people can be bought off? They don't have to be whacked. They can just be retired off with a nice pension or buying patents up. I'll buy that patent. You know, we all heard the stories about Tesla. And Tesla, you know, the CIA, whoever it was, came into that hotel he was living in, took all his papers, took the lot, and... Yeah. Well, the best story about Tesla is that he developed, you're maybe familiar with the Wardenclyffe Tower, where he was actually he told J.P. Morgan, who was the American financier who was paying for it all, he told them that he was working with radio waves and being able to transmit radio signals across the Atlantic, when what he was really doing was experimenting with his wireless power transmission. And Morgan was heavily invested in the utility industry and distributing electricity through wires. And he was probably invested in the copper industry, which made the wires. And so he was deeply invested in all of the infrastructure of power distribution at the time. And then when he learned, by whatever means, that Tesla was going to transmit power wirelessly through the ether, he said, okay, so how do we meter that? and when he was told, well, we can't meter that, he said, okay, shut it down. Yeah.
So that's the apocryphal story. I wasn't there at the time, so I don't know if it's true, but that's the kind of thing you're talking about. And I certainly think there is an element of that in how civilization has evolved in the past 100 and 150 years or so. And it's just a matter of how dark and what your proclivities are to go down the road of people are being killed because they've come to the threshold of some free energy discussion. I'm aware of the 0-point energy discussion, the idea that we can somehow draw energy from the vacuum. I don't know if that's true or not, but I am drawn toward the idea that Einstein's formula, E equals mc squared, can be contained in what amounts to a bottled star, and that great amounts of electricity can be generated from that. And then I think that becomes the power source for your interstellar travel machines, which get some of their propulsion and navigation from Townsend Brown's technology. I think there is arguably a connection there. And we have both of those technologies have been put within our field of vision, but kept without our reach.
Yeah. So we've done just over an hour now, Paul.
Yeah, how about that?
Yeah.
Have we talked about anything?
No,
Not really. Those are the best ones. These are my favorite episodes where we're not too regimented.
Yeah.
Is there anything, where do people need to go? I've got a link in the show notes for people who want to pick the books up from Amazon. Is there anywhere else where you'd like to send anyone?
Well, the website for Townsend Brown, where when I find some new nugget of information about him, is ttbrown.com. And we do have a forum behind it. It's ttbrown.com/forum. There's a link right at the top of the site. And there are a few of us, including a woman named Jan Lundquist, who has done an enormous amount of research and has much more detail. So there's a lot of detail that Jan posts in the forum. So if you want to know more about the particulars of Brown's movements over the course of his life, you can find that at ttbrown.com. And I keep a site. It hasn't been very active, but I hope it will be for the Farnsworth work at farnovision.com. And the origin of that name is years ago when I was trying to develop a movie for television about the boy who invented it, which, by the way, has not yet been made. Somebody just said sort of rhetorically, well, if the thing was invented by a guy named Farnsworth, why do we call it television instead of Farnovision? So my website for Farnsworth is farnovision.com, and that's been up since about 1998.
Wow.
And I also have a site for the people who are actually experimenting in real time with the Farnsworth approach to nuclear fusion at fuser.net. And there are probably almost 200 people in the world now who have built what is essentially a small scale replica of the Farnsworth future, and literally bottling stars in a jar and producing controlled nuclear fusion reactions in their basements and garages.
I hope there's none in Lancashire.
Hook up with,
that sounds dangerous.
with those people at fuser.net.
That sounds really dangerous,
sites.
that, Paul. Making stars in your garage.
Wow. Gotta make them somewhere.
It is not nearly as dangerous as it would be if you were building a nuclear fission reactor in your basement or garage. Right. And it is true that a fusion reactor will generate neutrons, it will generate gamma rays and X-rays, and you don't want to stand too close to it.
No.
It's good advice.
But it is a lot less radioactive byproducts than you get from a fission reactor. Cool. So it is a viable approach to using the power expressed in E equals mc squared in a relatively clean and safe way with a source of fuel that is inexhaustible for the life of our planet. You could not run out of deuterium fuel. It would take about 300 million years to use all the deuterium fuel on our planet, and by then the Earth will be a burned out meatball orbiting the flamed out sun.
That sounds a challenge. That's a challenge that I'm sure humanity will rise to.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
We'll have it all gone within 10 years.
Well,
I'm not too worried about that eventuality, but boy, Farnsworth talked about what we'd be able to do with fusion if we had it at our disposal. And he just talked about how much fun it was going to be.
The power of the sun in the
But he
palm
was
of
also-
my hand.
What's that?
The power of the sun in the palm of your hand. I believe that was Dr.
Yeah.
Octavius
Yeah.
Octopus from Spider-Man.
Oh.
So do you guys want to continue the discussion? Do you want to hear any more about the particulars of Townsend Brown's wanderings, or have we had a useful discussion?
I've loved it, Paul.
Yeah, it's been great.
We have to take a short break and then do our second half where we do news and stuff.
Oh,
so
okay, sure.
we can't stay too long,
Okay.
but it's been loads of fun.
Mm.
I've enjoyed it very much so.
And you'd have to come back.
Yeah, you should come
definitely.
back further down the line, and when you finish the next book.
When I finish the third book in 2048.
Yeah, we'll still
be
be
here.
here. We'll be here.
When podcasts are just delivered in our virtual headset.
Oh gosh.
You know.
Yeah. Right, this has been fab, Paul. Listen, you lot out there,
All right.
check out the links in the show notes and
Yeah,
follow up on this.
ttbrown.com, is it?
Yeah, and the books as well.
Farno
grab the
Vision.
books.
Yeah.
Paul, you stay on the line for us for 1 minute while we play ourselves out.
Yeah, sure.
And you lot watching
Okay.
live, we'll be back in 5, 7, 8 minutes, if time's even a real thing. Maybe we'll bend it.
That's
we'll
right.
bend it
Yeah.
slightly and come back earlier. I don't
not
know.
gonna happen.
Yeah, and we'll do some news and fun stuff in part 2. Okay, right. See you later.
All right.
Thanks for joining us.